This afternoon, we'll have a talk by Dr. Frazier Benya, and the talk will cover issues that we at the Berkeley Lab care deeply about. Our recent launch of our campaign on inclusion, diversity, equity, and accountability is part of a larger effort to create a welcoming and belonging culture here at our laboratory. Understanding how organizational norms contribute to sexual and gender harassment is an important first step in making sure that everyone in our community feels safe. In June of 2018, the National Academy of Science released their report, and it's entitled here, Sexual Harassment of Women, Climate, Culture, and Consequences in the Academic Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. As our lab director said in a recent email to the lab community at the time of the release of this report was developed to the highest standards that all National Academies studies are held to. And its recommendations underscore the critical importance of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office here at our lab. The Academy's president, Marcia McNutt, called the issuing of the report a watershed moment. Others say that it's the most comprehensive study yet on the extent of sexual harassment in STEM fields. Today, we have the privilege of hearing about this report from Dr. Frazier Benya. And Dr. Benya is a senior program officer at the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and is a member of the staff supporting the Committee on Women in Science, Engineering, and Medicine, which is a standing committee of the National Academies. Currently, Dr. Benya also serves as the director of the Action Collaborative on Preventing Sexual Harassment in Higher Education. Recently, she served as a study director for the National Academy study, which we'll hear about this afternoon. And her current work focuses on ensuring that science, engineering, and medicine are ethical and socially responsible, both in their practice and who gets to participate in the work. Previously, Dr. Benya worked with the National Academy of Engineering on improving and enhancing engineering ethics education, and on analyzing pathways engineers take from education to the workforce. She holds a BA with honors in science, technology, and society from the University of Puget Sound, and a master's of arts in bioethics, and a PhD in history of science, technology, and medicine, both from the University of Minnesota. She is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, and I'd like you all to join me in welcoming Dr. Benya to the stage. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me well enough? Okay, great. So what I'm going to do today is give you an overview of a 300-page document. There's plenty of research in it, so hopefully at the end I'm going to save a bunch of time for questions and discussion, and I encourage you to do that, as well as to join everyone in a collective brainstorming about how you might implement these recommendations at your institution. A quick sort of introduction to the National Academies. Some of you may be familiar with it, but the National Academies is a nonprofit organization that was started by the federal government to advise the nation on matters related to science, engineering, and medicine. And one of the foremost ways that we do this is through our consensus studies, which are what they sound like. We assemble a committee of experts that literally come to consensus about what the research says and what recommendations should be made. In this case, I was the study director for this report, which means I facilitated this committee of experts coming to consensus. All of the work at the National Academies for our consensus studies are given a statement of tasks that guides and constrains their work, and that was also the case with this study. This is the full statement of task for this study. It's long. You do not need to read it. I will give it to you briefly. This committee was charged with first determining the prevalence of sexual harassment among women in academic science, engineering, and medicine. Second, to determine the impact it has on the recruitment, retention, and advancement of women in these fields. And thirdly, to determine the most successful practices for addressing and preventing sexual harassment. I'm going to make a couple of notes about the statement of task. First, you will see it was directed to study just the experiences of women. That's not to say that men aren't sexually harassed. They are, but at much lower rates than women. This committee interpreted that charge to include sexual and gender minorities in order to cover people who identify as women as well. And I will also note that they interpreted this statement of task to include women at all levels in academia, from undergraduate students all the way up through faculty and staff. So the committee members I spoke of, this is the 21-person committee. It was chaired by Dr. Paula Johnson, who is a cardiologist and a president of Wellesley College. Dr. Sheila Widnall, who is professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The committee included a number of experts who include practicing scientists, engineers, and physicians, a psychiatrist, legal scholars, and most importantly, a number of social science researchers who have studied sexual harassment for decades. And it is in large part due to their work that this report reflects over 30 years of research. With all of the consensus studies at the National Academies, they are funded by external parties. In this case, this report was funded by a number of private foundations and public federal agencies. The National Science Foundation was the lead sponsor of this report, and they were joined by the federal agencies and private foundations you see listed here. All right, so I'm going to give you the 5 quick findings from this report, and then we'll dig into some of the research and details. The first thing the committee found is that there is extensive sexual harassment in these environments. The second is that gender harassment is the most common form of sexual harassment, and I'll get into what we mean by gender harassment in a moment. The third is that sexual harassment undermines research integrity, reduces the talent pool, and harms both targets and bystanders. The fourth is that the legal compliance system that we have in place is necessary, but not sufficient to reduce sexual harassment. But on the positive side, the committee found that changing the climate and culture in organizations can prevent and effectively address sexual harassment. So to dig into more details, we're going to start where the committee did, with what do we mean when we talk about sexual harassment. The committee reviewed the social science and legal scholarship and determined that sexual harassment is a form of discrimination that consists of 3 types of behavior. The first is sexual coercion. This refers to implicit or explicit attempts to make conditions of employment or education contingent upon sexual cooperation. This is the prototypical sleep with me or you're fired situation. It's often the first thing that comes to people's minds when they think of the term sexual harassment, but it is also the rarest form. The second type of sexual harassment is unwanted sexual attention. This refers to sexual advances that are unwelcome, unreciprocated, and unpleasant to the target. Included here are things like unwanted touching, hugging, stroking, kissing, relentless pressure for dates, or sexual behavior despite discouragement. This is a form of sexual harassment that can and sometimes does include sexual assault, meaning something can be both a civil rights violation and a crime. All that said, most of the time, sexual harassment takes the form of a put down and does not have the appearances of being a come on, as these first 2 types I described do. Sexual harassment's most common form is gender harassment. This refers to verbal and visual conduct that conveys hostility, objectification, exclusion, or second-class status about members of one gender. These are comments like women aren't cut out to be surgeons or girls don't belong in engineering. It also reflects degrading images and words in the ambient environment, like porn, lewd graffiti, sexual slurs, those sorts of things. Gender harassment is considered a form of sexual harassment because it is based on one's sex. The figure on the right, this circle diagram, is designed to show you how sexual harassment is situated in the legal sphere of discriminatory behavior. So the broader circle are discriminatory behaviors. Within that is the category of sex and gender-based discrimination. And within that is the specific form of sexual harassment with the 3 behaviors I just described sort of around the edge. Those three behaviors are color-coded in this example to delineate how the legal terms map to these behaviors. So in the legal sphere, they classify sexual harassment in two ways: as either quid pro quo sexual harassment, which maps perfectly to the sexual coercion, or as a hostile environment harassment. Hostile environment harassment can be created by either pervasive or severe gender harassment, or pervasive and severe unwanted sexual attention. To help convey some of the research findings around the term sexual harassment and how it plays out, the committee overlaid these definitions onto this iceberg image. So in this image, the water line conveys the level of public consciousness or public awareness. What's above the water line is what people think of when they hear the term sexual harassment. What's below the water line is often what people do not think of when they hear the term sexual harassment. So at the top of the iceberg, most readily recognizable in the eyes of the public, is sexual coercion and some forms of unwanted sexual attention. These are the behaviors that break through to public consciousness and get widely recognized as being impermissible. These are also the behaviors that institutional policies and procedures often focus on. But the research is quite clear. As I said, the most common form is gender harassment. Again, the sexist and sexualized insults that demean, denigrate, and humiliate people in gender-related ways. As committee member Dr. Lilia Cortina puts it, gender harassment is not about romance gone awry. It's not about trying to pull women into sexual relationships. Instead, it's about pushing women out of careers where they're seen not to fit and not to belong. The gender harassing conduct in this image, of course, is submerged underwater because most people don't realize it's a form of sexual harassment. But as with icebergs, what is underwater is crucially important and rather dangerous. It might be tempting to assume a continuum of severity within these various acts of abuse. For instance, that what's at the top of the iceberg is somehow worse than what's at the bottom of the iceberg. But the committee reviewed the evidence for this assumption and found that none of it holds up to scientific scrutiny. The research actually reveals that even when sexual harassment entails nothing but gender harassment, without any of the unwanted sexual pursuit, it takes a toll on victims. In fact, the research shows that severe or frequent gender harassment does the same professional and psychological damage as an isolated instance of sexual coercion. Additionally, according to over 30 years of research on sexual harassment in workplace and education settings, the committee found that sexually harassing behavior can be either direct, targeted at an individual, or ambient, a general level of sexual harassment in an environment, and it is harmful in both cases. As a result of these research findings, the committee recommends that leaders in academic institutions and research and training sites pay increased attention to and enact policies that cover gender harassment as a means of addressing the most common form of sexual harassment and of preventing other types of sexually harassing behavior. Now, I'll get to the last part of that about why the gender harassing, preventing the gender harassing stuff could prevent other forms in a moment. So the next question becomes, okay, we know what we're talking about. How prevalent is it? The committee found that for women, faculty, and staff, over 50% of them experience sexual harassment. And this is based on surveys that ask women about their experiences over a 1 to 2 year time period. This is not over their lifetime. For women students, they experience sexual harassment at the hands of faculty and staff. 20 to 50% of them experience this. We do not have great numbers for the rate of sexual harassment that is perpetrated by peers for students, but there are researchers working on that, and there is a recent study I'm happy to talk about at the end if you're interested. So I'm now going to show you a specific survey from a large public university to help reveal some of the findings around gender harassment, how common it is, and how often it appears in these environments combined with other behavior. So in this circle diagram, I'm going to draw your attention first to the gray wedge of the circle, the 37%. These are the lucky few who experienced no form of sexual harassment. Everyone else experienced some form of sexual harassment. So the next part of this circle wedge to pay attention to is the green 5%. This is the only group that did not experience some form of gender harassment. Everyone else who experienced sexual harassment experienced gender harassment either on its own or with other types of sexual harassing behavior. In part, this is why researcher and committee member Dr. Lilia Cortina talks about gender harassment as the gateway drug to other forms of sexual harassment. This next slide presents the data the committee had analyzed for students in order to determine if there were differences in rates of sexual harassment between the different fields of science, engineering, and medicine, and then non-STEM fields. This also gives you some context for how prevalent the different types of sexual harassment are. These are consistent with findings across multiple workplace settings and education environments. So to begin with, the orange bar is the sexual coercion. And as you can see, that is hovering rather consistently at 1%. The next bar is the teal unwanted sexual attention, which is ranging between 2 and 4%. So again, rather rare. The next two bars are the gender harassment form. In this case, the researchers divided up into two subcategories, sexist hostility and crude behavior. And you can begin to see the significant rise in prevalence for these behaviors. You're also probably noting the rather high rate of gender harassment in medical school environments. That is important. The committee noted that, and there are some hypotheses for why that might be the case. But for this audience, I would flag that you shouldn't assume that somehow science is better than medicine. Science, in this case, is averaging across all of the fields of medicine. And as I'll talk later, there are some risk factors that mean that some disciplines within science are likely experiencing much higher rates of sexual harassment, and they're being averaged out by some fields in science that have much lower rates of sexual harassment in science. The research on prevalence of sexual harassment across workplace and education settings also reveals that those with intersecting identities have different experiences of sexual harassment. Specifically, women of color will experience more harassment than white women, white men, or men of color will. And particularly, it's important to note that women of color often experience sexual harassment that includes racial harassment. It is somehow inextricably intertwined. It's not just sexual harassment, it's not just racial harassment, it is both. Additionally, sexual and gender minority people experience more sexual harassment than their heterosexual women do. And so now that we know how prevalent this is, the question becomes, how damaging is this? The committee found that sexual harassment undermines women's professional and educational attainment and their mental and physical health. When it comes to mental and physical health, the more often women are harassed, the more they report symptoms of depression, disordered eating, stress, anxiety, physical complaints like headaches, exhaustion, and sleep disruption. According to one study, 1 in 5 sexually harassed women will meet the clinical criteria for major depressive disorder. 1 in 5. The same study found that 1 in 10 will meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. And according to another study that looked just at the exposure to sexist comments, so in other words, the gender harassing conduct, they found that exposure to sexual harassment will trigger greater cardiovascular reactivity, which over the long term can put women at increased risk for coronary heart disease and depressed immune functioning. When it comes to professional and educational attainment, dozens of studies have made clear that sexual harassment derails women's work lives. When women are sexually harassed in an environment, they will find their jobs less satisfying and more stressful. Many will engage in some form of work withdrawal, meaning they remain with their institution but disengage from their work. Others will simply leave their institution, sometimes to take positions at a different institution, but other times to leave their fields altogether. It is important to note that all of these actions that are taken by victims are done so in an effort to escape an abusive situation. Part of what the committee did in this research was also have a consultant group conduct a series of qualitative interview research to reveal how this work withdrawal and how the process of reporting plays out for academic researchers. And so what I'm going to share with you in a couple of places and in this next slide are some quotes from this interview research that help to illustrate in these women's words how this played out. So this first one begins to illustrate how this sort of professional consequences of coming forward and reporting something played out for her. So there's been a negative kind of chain of events where supervisors at the institution have seen that I dropped out of the research project and may not understand because they were never told what happened. So it seems I've been blacklisted in some ways and not invited to join other research projects and perhaps seen as a failure. This next one is from a faculty member in engineering describing her decision to leave. This is why I made this decision of leaving that university. Even though I liked the department, I liked the students, I liked the place, I had to leave it just because I didn't want this bitterness to continue and affect me personally and professionally. The picture is just as bleak for women students in these settings. As their education takes a hit, they take various measures to avoid a hostile learning environment. They will change advisors, change majors, drop out of classes, and even drop out of school altogether. In addition, the committee found that one need not be directly targeted with sexual harassment to feel its effects. Research shows that people who merely see sexual harassment targeted at others in the same setting will report negative outcomes that parallel those of direct victims. So the same emotional, psychological damage, the same work withdrawal that the victim experiences. For example, employees who observe sexually harassing conduct toward women describe that same lower well-being, which will then translate into the same higher withdrawal from their work. It is important to note that the research reveals that these effects emerge for both male and female bystanders. And so, in other words, as Dr. Lilia Cortina puts it, when women are sexually harassed in a context, women leave, their coworkers leave, even the men leave. They don't stick around to watch their valued colleagues be disparaged, and they certainly don't want to become the next target. All employees and all students, regardless of gender, suffer from spending time in a hostile environment. Now, we would like to think that because sexual harassment is illegal, that it won't happen. And because organizations and institutions have policies and practices forbidding sexual harassment, that it won't occur. But despite significant attention to this topic in recent years, the committee found nothing to suggest that the standard anti-harassment policies and procedures that are present at most institutions have made any significant reduction in sexual harassment. The committee found that this is because the judicial interpretation of the law requires that these policies and procedures be in place, but not that they be in any way effective. Ultimately, the committee concluded that the legal system alone is not an adequate mechanism for reducing or preventing sexual harassment. That said, adherence to such legal requirements is necessary. It's just not sufficient if we're going to change things to prevent sexual harassment. While reviewing the legal system, the committee also noted that the laws and policies reflect an inaccurate assumption that victims of sexual harassment will report the abuse formally and promptly. The research is actually quite clear that the least common response for women is to formally report the sexually harassing experience. For many, this is due to an accurate perception that they may experience retaliation or other negative outcomes associated with their personal and professional lives. The research shows that only around 1/3 of women will reach out to those in their organization to informally discuss an experience, that is, share it with a colleague or do so in a generic way that does not reveal specific individuals involved. But for making formal reports, the rates are even lower. One study looking at undergraduate students found that only 7% will formally report their experience, while a study of graduate students found that only 6% will formally report. For many who experience sexual harassment, they want the behavior to end. They want it to stop. They want to get back to the work or the school that they were there to do in the first place. Most do not want to get entangled in a legalistic grievance or investigation process that research shows and that they are accurately perceiving can victimize them further. I'm going to share another quote here to illustrate some of how this plays out. This is from a faculty member in medicine. I would tell friends outside the profession who would be like, "Are you kidding me? What?" But the people who work for this institution were like, "Can't you just suck it up? This is not going to go well for you if you report. You don't want to make a fuss." I knew they were right, but at the same time, I really was like, this is just too much. I shouldn't have to be preparing to get raped when I go to work. The committee concluded that effectively addressing sexual harassment through the law or through institutional policies or procedures requires taking into account that targets of sexual harassment are unlikely to report sexual harassment and often face retaliation for reporting, despite that retaliation being illegal. Ultimately, the committee concluded that it is time to consider approaches that address the systems, cultures, and climates that enable sexual harassment to thrive. They stated that academic institutions need to move away from a culture of compliance and towards a culture of respect. They need to move beyond legalistic policies and trainings focused only on the most obvious acts of abuse, if you will, the above the waterline behaviors, and stop relying solely on formal reports. Now, you might ask, how do we change the culture and the climate in institutions? And to figure out how this might occur, the committee went back to the research to look at what are risk factors for sexual harassment, what predicts high rates of sexual harassment in environments. And I will note that they did find that it is environmental factors, not the factors of one individual person, that are likely to predict the rates of sexual harassment. So there are two main factors the committee pointed towards as areas where we need to focus our attention. The first is the risk factor of a male-dominated environment. This can be created in one of three ways. If the overall numbers in environment are male-dominated. So engineering is a perfect example of this. At every level in engineering, from undergraduate through graduate student, in faculty and staff, and in industry, it is a male-dominated environment in which men outnumber women. You can create a male-dominated environment also just by having a male-dominated leadership. Medicine is an example of this right now. For the last couple of years, the medical student population has been at gender parity, but the leadership in medicine is still heavily male-dominated. The third way you can create a male-dominated environment is if it is culturally seen as abnormal for women to do the work. So we might say in our society that it is seen as abnormal for a woman to work on an oil rig. And that cultural belief is enough to make that environment a male-dominated one. You only need one of these. You'll of course notice that in some disciplines within science, engineering, and medicine, it achieves all three of those risks. The second risk factor is an organizational tolerance for sexual harassment. And there are three ways that this gets created. The first is if the community perceives that reporting is risky. The second is if the community perceives that reports are not taken seriously when someone comes forward. And the third is if the community perceives that offenders escape sanctions. I emphasize that this is about the community perception for every one of these because this is about the inherent difference between an organizational climate and an organizational culture. So an organizational culture are the mission and values, that your institution says they ascribe to. It's the things that we put on about pages and mission statements. Sometimes we even inscribe them onto the walls of buildings. The organizational climate, however, is how your community lives and experiences those values on a day-to-day basis. So the example I give that brings this home for academics is that in academia, we say that we value, our cultural value is to hold research, service, and teaching as equally important. That is our culture. We say that. But the climate, as many of you I'm sure will recognize, says something different. The climate says that we value research above all else. And so that is what is happening with sexual harassment. We have policies and we have procedures in place that say that we do not tolerate sexual harassment, but the climate on the ground, how people experience it on a day-to-day basis, tells them that we tolerate it. So building on, one last point. It is this organizational climate that is actually the greatest predictor of sexual harassment. So as a result of both these risk factors, this committee made a series of recommendations for where we need to focus our work in trying to prevent sexual harassment. We need to eliminate these risk factors. I will note that these recommendations serve as a roadmap for where we need to focus our attention and our effort. Some of these require a fair amount of out-of-the-box creative thinking on the part of the community in science, engineering, and medicine. Some are spaces where there's more research. Others are spaces in which we have no specific example to give you for how to do this yet. So to begin, this is a handout that summarizes these key recommendations. It's available on our website. It's a convenient cheat sheet to take with you. You can download it for free. I'll walk you through these recommendations though. The first is to create diverse, inclusive, and respectful environments. And by this, the committee begins to address this male-dominated environment as well as a number of other things. But here they spoke about the need to explicitly examine hiring and promotion processes to ensure that the values and mission statements that we have are actually reflected in these policies and procedures, and to begin to rectify the underrepresentation of women at every level. The committee also spoke about the need to make use of civility promotion programs, which are a new area of research that has shown effectiveness. And the reason for this is because when an environment has high rates of incivility, it will have high rates of sexual harassment. The committee also spoke about the need to interrupt and intervene in inappropriate behavior. This is commonly known as the bystander intervention approach. Again, to signal in the moment that we are not tolerating sexual harassment and to give people the tools to do so. The fourth piece here is to develop training that actually aims to change behavior, not necessarily change beliefs. Many of you, I'm sure, have experienced the sort of standard anti-harassment training that exists in institutions. Those are often not ever evaluated. And when they have been evaluated, they have only been evaluated to determine whether or not they've increased someone's awareness of the policy or the procedure or of the term sexual harassment. And that is a nice goal, but the ultimate goal is whether or not we are getting people to stop sexually harassing. And when researchers have looked at whether increasing awareness translated into a change in behavior, they found that it did not. So we need to start by reconfiguring our training to actually be designed to change behavior. The second key recommendation is to diffuse the hierarchical and dependent relationship between trainees and faculty. This is not really a new recommendation. There have been reports inside the academies and from other institutions that have made recommendations of this sort and suggested things like mentoring networks, committee-based advising, as well as providing sources of independent research funding to diffuse that power differential that the PI may hold over the student. The reason this committee made this recommendation is because when there is a power differential between two parties and the victim is on the lower end, the impacts of the sexual harassment will be felt that much worse. So it's about addressing the damage that's done here. The third recommendation is to provide supports for targets. And here we're going to begin to see the connections back to the piece of organizational climate in which it is seen as risky to report. So if we can make it seem less risky to report, then maybe we'll begin to change the climate. Here, the committee spoke about the need to provide access to support services without a requirement of making a formal report. They also spoke about the need to provide alternative and less formal means of recording information about an experience and handling a report of sexual harassment. Some specifics here that the committee noted, the use of anonymous tools to record or document an experience. There are now online tools, one that's prominently known as Callisto, that allows someone to record their experience, timestamp, date it, so that when they feel comfortable, 2 months, 3 months, 2 years later, they have that time-stamped record of what they experienced. Systems like that are also providing mechanisms for allowing victims to connect with others who have the same perpetrator, so they can enter in a record of what they experienced, name their perpetrator. The system holds that information essentially in escrow. And when another person comes forward, totally independent, names that same perpetrator with their experience, then the system will inform the two that the other exists. And then they can decide whether or not they want to proceed. Other mechanisms for handling reports of sexual harassment, the committee noted, are the use of ombuds officers or anonymous folks or confidential folks that can talk through with a victim what their options are, as well as the use of restorative justice measures to address issues of sexual harassment. The third piece here is to address issues of retaliation and work towards preventing them. Most institutions rely on the fact that it is illegal. They tell people it's illegal and not to do it, and then they stop there. But if we're to take retaliation seriously and preventing sexual harassment, then the first thing we would need to do is start thinking about the ways in which someone could be retaliated against in these situations, and then work to insulate them and protect them from that risk. This is an area where we don't have anything to suggest yet, and creative thinking is needed. The fourth recommendation is to improve transparency and accountability. Here, we will see the connection back to that organizational climate, particularly around the community perceiving that they will not be taken seriously if they come forward, and the community perceiving that perpetrators escape sanctions. So what we want to do is make sure that people feel like they will be taken seriously and that perpetrators are facing sanctions. So to do so, the committee recommends that we have clear policies and procedures that make clear what the expectations of behavior are and include a range of escalating disciplinary consequences that maps to the severity of the behavior. The second piece here is to improve transparency about the handling of reports. In this regard, the committee pointed to institutions that are producing annual reports that provide statistical summaries of information about how often in a year a report came forward to the institution, either informally or formally, how many of them turned into a formal investigation process, how long that investigation process may have taken, how often there was a finding of responsibility versus a finding of not enough evidence, or finding that it was not actually validated at all. These reports often also include information about what types of disciplinary consequences were given out as a result of a finding of responsibility. The third piece here is to improve transparency by assessing the institution's climate through climate surveys, to not rely on formal reporting numbers for an assessment of how much of a problem this is, but to use climate surveys that can give you accurate prevalence numbers, and to make the findings of those surveys available to the community. This final recommendation is to strive for strong and diverse leadership, for leaders to make it an explicit goal to reduce and prevent sexual harassment during their tenure, but also for institutions to develop leadership skills in the areas of conflict resolution, mediation, negotiation, and de-escalation to help them address these issues as they come up. I will note that the committee specifically interpreted leadership in a very broad way. So from your traditional leadership positions of university presidents, provosts, and chancellors, but all the way down to the teaching assistant at the head of the classroom, who in that moment is setting a climate, whether they're tolerating or not tolerating that behavior. So I'm now going to switch and give you very briefly a little bit of information about what we've done since the release of this report. So we released it in June 2018. It received widespread public attention, and committee members or myself have spoken with a number of institutions. I think there have been over 50 events that we've done since June of 2018. As a result of those conversations, we heard that many institutions were interested in working to implement these recommendations, but they wanted to build on what other institutions were doing. They wanted a collaborative space. So following the release of this report, the National Academies formed in April of this year an action collaborative on preventing sexual harassment in higher education. An action collaborative is essentially a coalition of the willing that come together to work on a system-wide problem that involves multiple stakeholders. The role of the academies in this work is to provide a forum for these stakeholders to set goals, share best practices, and make progress towards preventing sexual harassment. The formal objective of this action collaborative is to spur targeted collective action that moves beyond basic legal compliance towards evidence-based policies and practices for addressing and preventing all forms of sexual harassment in higher education, and for promoting a culture of civility and respect. There are 4 specific goals for this action collaborative. The first and the most obvious, but probably the least challenging, to raise awareness about sexual harassment, its consequences, and the approaches for addressing it. The second, to share and elevate evidence-based policies and strategies for reducing and preventing sexual harassment. The third, to contribute to setting a research agenda in this space and to sharing research results across institutions. And the fourth, to developing a standard for measuring progress towards reducing and preventing sexual harassment in higher education. Much of the work of the Action Collaborative is being carried out by 4 working groups that will focus on the areas of prevention, response, remediation, and evaluation. All of these working groups will also take into account several cross-cutting themes, including taking into account the experiences of those with intersecting identities, taking into account power differentials between individuals and stakeholder groups, and considering how to scale efforts from one type of institution to another. At the end of each year, the Action Collaborative will hold a large public summit to share information from the Action Collaborative with others in the broader community, and for experts and stakeholders to inform and influence the work the Action Collaborative is doing. The 2019 summit will be held on November 19th and 20th at the University of Washington, and more information will be available about that in the coming weeks. Just a quick note of the institutions involved. There are over 50 institutions that have joined the collaborative, and they include large public and private institutions, smaller technical and liberal arts institutions, community colleges, minority serving institutions, and research and training sites. Each member of the Action Collaborative has committed to developing new approaches to the problem from a preventative orientation. They've also committed to implementing and testing new or revised programs, policies, and practices each year. They've also committed to share the results from these new revised approaches each year. And fourth, they've also committed to identifying and engaging a broader group of individuals at their institution in this work. Ultimately, through our work with this Action Collaborative, it is the goal of the academies and the goal that this report not just sit on a shelf, but actually be put into use to guide the work that needs to be done to treat this problem as the public health problem that it actually is. So I'll conclude there, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about the research or to begin hearing the ideas from you all about how these things might play out at your institution.
So thank you for this seminar, and I would like everyone to thank Dr. Benya for sharing the results.